A very good afternoon, friends. So I hope you're all doing safe as well as healthy. Well, in a couple of videos, I have been discussing the aspect of India's 12 with you. And if you recall, I had given the concept of a 5-step model as far as India's 12 is concerned. The step number 1 was to calculate a carrying amount of the asset and liability. And the step number 2 was calculating a tax base. In the previous videos, we've covered these two aspects with you. In this video today, I'm going to discuss the concept of step number 3, which mathematically involves comparing the step number 1 and the step number 2. So if you look at this, it's a very simple comparison, but of course, there are more insights related to the step number 3. So let's, I think, dig a little further apart from the mathematical comparison, whether this comparison leads to a temporary difference which is taxable or deductible in nature. And accordingly, let's see some more exceptions, prohibitions, etc. Let's find this out in detail with you. आज मैं आपको बहुत ही ज़बरदस्त खबर देने जा रहा हूँ. सर कौन सी ज़बरदस्त खबर है? भाई ज़बरदस्त खबर ये है कि अनअकैडमी पर अगर आप अपनी सीए एग्जामिनेशन की तैयारी कर रहे हैं तो आपको 7 डेज का एक कंप्लीट फ्री ट्रायल मिलेगा प्लस सब्सक्रिप्शन के अंदर. यानी आप 7 डेज सीए की किसी भी कैटेगरी के अंदर फाउंडेशन या फिर इंटरमीडिएट या फिर फाइनल ग्रुप 1 ग्रुप 2 में से किसी भी कैटेगरी के अंदर 7 डेज आप फ्री ट्रायल ले सकते हैं. सर इसके लिए करना क्या होगा? भाई सिंपल 4 स्टेप्स आपने फॉलो करने हैं. सबसे पहले तो आप अनअकैडमी की ऐप अपने मोबाइल में डाउनलोड कर लीजिए और इसको आप डाउनलोड कर सकते हैं इवन बाय स्कैनिंग द क्यूआर कोड. इसके बाद आप जब ऐप डाउनलोड कर लें तो आप सीए एग्जाम्स के गोल में उसके अंदर जाके आपने अपने आप को रजिस्टर करना है. रजिस्टर करने के बाद आपने अपने ट्रायल को कैसे अवेल करना है? एक कोड इस्तेमाल करना है. अब आप कौन सा कोड इस्तेमाल करेंगे? कोड इस्तेमाल कीजिए CAKB10. जैसे ही आप ये कोड इस्तेमाल करेंगे आपकी कोड एक्टिवेट होते ही आपकी लर्निंग शुरू हो जाएगी. यानी कि फॉर 7 days यू कैन वॉच ऑल दी क्लासेस अंडर प्लस सब्सक्रिप्शन एब्सोल्युटली फ्री. साहब इससे बढ़िया ऑफर क्या होगी? यानी कि आप 7 दिन के अंदर जो चाहें देखिए और फिर अपना मन बनाइए कि भाई आपने कौन सा प्लान इसके अंदर लेना है. तो पहले 7 दिन का ट्रायल लीजिए. उसके बाद ये ऑफर लेकिन 20 जून से 24 जून के बीच में है. यानी कि आप जिस दिन ये ऑफर अवेल करते हैं 24 जून से पहले आप अवेल करें. उसके बाद आपकी ऑफर 7 डेज तक चलेगी. है ना जबरदस्त खबर? तो भाई किस बात का इंतजार कर रहे हैं? आइए लेट्स क्रैक इट. You can see an interesting chart which is summarizing the concept of the step number 3, where you would compare the carrying amount computed in step 1 versus the tax base computed in step number 2. Now there are two possibilities. Let's talk about an asset separately and let's talk about a liability separately. Now if you compare the position as far as asset is concerned, there will be two situations. Either the carrying amount is greater than the tax base or it is the other way around. Now, if the carrying amount is more as compared to the tax base, it represents a taxable temporary difference and which would ultimately lead to a creation of a DDL. And as far as asset is concerned, the carrying amount is less. It results in a deductible temporary differences which would result in a DDA. Trust me, as far as liability is concerned, it's exactly a reverse position. That means if the carrying amount of the liability is more than the tax base, it results in a deductible difference and a DDA. And for a liability, if the carrying amount is less as compared to the tax base, then it results in a taxable difference and that would mean a DTL. Now this is a very simple mathematical exercise that you are comparing the carrying amount of the asset vis-a-vis the tax base of the asset and liability, and you're saying that it's a taxable or deductible difference. In a nutshell, we can say if the carrying amount of the asset is more than the tax base, it's taxable difference, and for liability, reverse. For an asset, if the carrying amount is less than the tax base, and for a liability, reverse. So you accordingly get a taxable temporary difference or deductible temporary difference. Now, let's take this step a little further. Now, if I look at the standard, typically the para number 15 and the para number 24, which talks about the taxable and deductible differences, you'll see something very interesting. I would say that all taxable differences can be segregated into three categories. One is a situation where the standard prohibits the creation of a DDL. I'm talking of taxable temporary differences. So we can say block number one is a case of prohibition where the standard says that you don't have to create the deferred tax liability. Now, I would say that there are two cases of prohibition where the standard prohibits the creation of a DDL. One is with reference to goodwill arising on a business combination, and one is, you can say, a case of a permanent difference. Then there is a block number two, which talks about that the DTL may or may not be created. So that depends upon certain conditions. So I would say there is a block one containing two cases of exceptions, two cases of prohibitions where DTL is not to be created. Then you can say one case of a condition, where you need to fulfill certain conditions. In that case, you create a DTL. Leaving the prohibitions and leaving the case of conditional case, I would say in all other cases, if there is a taxable difference, we need to recognize a DDL. So I would say that when you view a taxable temporary difference, look at the fact, is it falling in exceptions? The two exceptions are there, which we'll be discussing in the coming videos. One is a case of investments which need certain parameters to be evaluated, and leaving this investments and exceptions, every case you create a DTL. Similarly, in terms of deductible temporary differences, I would say that all the questions can be categorized in three cases. There is one case of a prohibition where the standard says no, you cannot create a DTA. Then there is another case of investment, which is again conditional, that DTA may or may not get created. And for rest all the cases other than the prohibitions and the case of exceptions, I would say we need to create a DTA, but subject to the concept of prudence. A DTA requires, it can be recognized in the books of accounts only and only when there is a prudence, a reasonable certainty that a future taxable income would arise. So what are we looking in terms of step number 3 in a summary? When you compare the carrying amount versus the tax base for an asset, your carrying amount is more, it's a taxable difference resulting in DTL. Vice versa, it's a deductible difference resulting in a DTA. That's one. Now, when you're looking at a case of a taxable differences, there are two exceptions where the standard says no DTL to be created. There is one case of investments where the standard says please evaluate. Then for rest of the cases, create a DTL. Then if you look at a DTA, I would say there is one exception where the standard prohibits a creation of a DTA. There is one case of investments which requires evaluations. Rest all the cases create a DTA, but a creation is subject to the concept of prudence. Now what we're going to do in the coming videos, we're going to start looking into these exceptions. That is where the standard prohibits the creation of a DTL or a DTA. We'll start looking at the cases of investments, and then automatically we'll be becoming experts on the step number 3. So that's all in this particular video. Watch for more interesting videos coming on India's 12. Thank you and take care.